Pranjal, we're ready.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this edition of our series of webinars that we've been holding for the last few months. This is on consumption-led growth, a topic I think which is of interest to almost everybody. Where is the consumer sentiment, and what are we going to be? What are the trends that are emerging so far, and what does it mean for all of us? We are recording this session, and the session will be chaired by Mr. Giridhar Sanjeevi. Before handing it over to him, just a quick point. All the audience is on mute to ensure that we have minimum audio disturbance. All the question answers, please place them in the chat box, and Giri would be delighted to pick up those questions. And if you have any suggestions, please do let us know at our email, which is secretariat@cfoboard.com. We'll put up an email a little later also. So over to you, Giri, for introduction of the speakers as well as the launch of the session.
Okay, thank you, Pranjal. I think it's really very nice to be with all of you this morning. The CFO Board was founded sometime in 2014 or 15 or so, and for the last 5-6 years has been trying to do work which is relevant to the economy as well as to the finance function. And I think this pandemic is definitely giving us opportunities to engage with the wider audience in a meaningful way, and consumption-led growth is kind of a very nice theme actually. Before I get into the session, let me quickly introduce the participants. So we have Kaval Singh, who is the founder and managing partner of Fireside Ventures. We have Dipanjan Basu, again from Fireside Ventures, who was earlier with Mintra. We have Shyam Krishnan from Bain & Company joining us, and I will try and moderate the session, this morning's session. Before I hand over to the panelists, I just wanted to introduce the session. I think fundamentally, if you see the growth in the last few years in India, I think very clearly with the young population, there is increasing reliance in India on consumption-led growth, not just in rural areas, but in urban areas actually. And therefore, I think very clearly, this will be the cornerstone in terms of a lot of our growth going forward as well actually. And what is also interesting is that while this trend has been happening, while the private sector obviously has been trying to take advantage of it in terms of how to sort of pivot into these trends, I think the government has not been lagging behind actually. So if you see some of the things that they have done have actually enabled it, starting with the Aadhaar, which with the NPCI systems which were set up, the Jan Dhan accounts, which with an effort to convert the informal economy to the formal economy. Related is the GST kind of reforms, the work that the government is doing in terms of enabling micro and small enterprises actually, in terms of bringing them and enabling them, because that's a very big sector of growth. Financialization of savings, a whole bunch of things that the government has been doing actually, because ultimately growth in any form has to be a very symbiotic partnership between what the government does and what the private sector does in terms of enabling the growth actually. So there's lots happening actually. And I think, of course, the COVID pandemic has been a massive root shock to a lot of us actually, in terms of this, the way in which the suddenness of it and the impact that it has done. But equally, COVID is a very big opportunity in terms of accelerating some of these trends actually. For many companies, it is merely an acceleration of trends that they had already begun. And for many companies, it means that some things have fundamentally changed and they need to pivot actually. So I think without getting into too much more, what I will do is that I will pass it on to Shyam Krishnan from Bain to give his perspective in terms of how we see the consumer trends in India, and then we can take on the others. Over to you, Shyam.
Thank you very much, Giri. Sakshi, if you could stop presenting, I'll take it over. Thank you. Right. Good morning, everyone. And really, in these unprecedented times, hope everyone's doing well, and your families are staying safe as well. It's my privilege today to first kind of open this discussion on the overall macro trends. What I'll try and focus on over the next 10-15 minutes or so is touch upon 3 topics, but really start by zooming out and look at India more from a 10-year horizon. Look at 2030 and what the future of consumption looks like. While COVID is very top of mind, I think it's very important for us not to lose sight of what's coming up over the next 10 years. So I'll start with that. Talk a bit about the consumer trends that were prevalent even before COVID, as well as, given COVID, what are some of those accelerations or changes that have happened and what implications that would have for all of us. So with that context, just talking about the overall consumption, we believe that there are four forces that are going to shape the future of consumption over the next decade in India. Starting with the overall economy and the macro environment and the demographic shifts. This is going to be very, very pronounced in India, and I'll talk more about that. The third one is around consumer attitude and preference. How is that kind of evolving over the next few years? And finally, it is technology. And there are interrelationships across all of these layers that we're going to see going forward. I think the big message to really talk about is, if I go 2 years back, 2018 to 2030, this year notwithstanding, we are talking about $35 trillion in consumption spend over the span of these 12 years. And we're talking about within the GDP, we are a heavy consumption driven economy anyway. So there's about $1.5 trillion, when you look at 2018, which is expected to go to about $5 trillion, even assuming this year going to be, not, in fact, being either flat or even lower. We're talking about $5 trillion. What's very interesting about this increase in consumption is a lot of it is actually going to be driven by the middle income households. As you can see there, 80% of the consumption in 2030 is going to be driven by the middle class. And that's a very big shift, demographic shift that we're going to all need to be prepared for. If I look at the whole economic pyramid that we had, in 2005, about 70% of the households were what we call the low income. So less than $4,000 annual household income. And this is more in the shape of an Eiffel Tower. And over the last decade or so, this has morphed into what today we see as the income pyramid. And this is, where again, about 43% in the low, but, increasingly more getting into the middle class as we are seeing. Over 2030, we anticipate that this pyramid shape is essentially going to become a diamond with a lot more, as I said, contributing, the consumption coming in from the middle class itself. And this is a big shift that we are talking about. And what's also interesting here is about the working age population. We all know that India is one of those few countries, large economies rather, where we have a low average age, it's a young population. And what's the implication of that is, again, over the next decade, we are going to add more working age people to the world than any other nation. And that's very significant. Now we'll have to see how, what kind of occupation they pick up and how this is going to trend. But demographically, we couldn't have been in a better situation, compared to what we're talking about. When we say consumption, it's good to kind of disaggregate that and see what is that going to be constituted in terms of the different elements. So I think about half of the consumption increase that we're talking about is really about more people spending more often. So this is really the story of penetration and a lot more kind of people spending on existing categories. And it's about the value price points that it's going to be available at. That's going to be roughly half of the driver of the consumption growth. Another about 25% is going to come from premiumization. This is people kind of trading up within the same categories that they're purchasing today. And the rest, about 20%, is going to be new categories that are going to be added to the consumption basket. And at this point, it's actually fascinating to see, if you look at FMCG categories, which is again quite well penetrated, we believe. If you look at the top brands that have more than 50% household penetration, meaning, at least 1 in 2 households use this brand in India, there are only a handful, less than 10 brands in India actually have 50% household penetration. So it's really a story of, how new brands can come in, how do we cater to this massive consumption demand that the consumers are going to have in India, and how do we go from there? The other view when we talk about disaggregation is we typically use this standard nomenclature of urban versus rural. And now we see a lot of companies now talking about the 14 clusters, winning in many Indias, and you have Dabur looking at rice, and there are so many different micro market views that are there. One interesting thing when we looked at some of this data is within urban, you can actually classify that as 3 very, very distinct geographic cuts. So there's metros, there's what we call the boom towns, a lot of the tier 1s, and then we have rest of urban. And similarly, rural has an element of developed rural and rest of rural. And this, I'd like to focus on this rest of urban and developed rural. There are about 10,000 towns with the population of about 50,000 per town. And similarly, about 50,000 villages we're talking about. Now, if I just focus on rest of urban and developed rural, What's fascinating in their income pattern is you will see this. So the dark red here is the high income. And this is again the income pyramid. They almost mirror each other in terms of the spread of income group. This is what is very critical. I mean, it's agricultural income, it's all of that. But the fact that there is buying power is very evident, even if you look at developed rural and very comparable to the rest of urban. There are about 15% of India's population today that lives in these developed rural areas. And not just, about money and, the fact that they have wealth. It is also very interesting to see that they're very aware of the tech-enabled consumption models. So, access is a problem. Aspiration is not a problem at all. So, these are consumers who are online. In fact, when they purchase, they're using the internet for pre-purchase searches, and they're heavily aspirational. So, and it's fascinating, again, if you look at multiple categories, when you launch a new subcategory, whether it's a face wash, whether it's, one of those kind of nuanced subcategories, the adoption, if it's available at the right price point in the right stores, is actually quite high for this particular segment. The next and the most kind of, strong trend that we're looking at is the internet penetration. We are saying that by 2030, 2 in 3 Indians will be online. And this is almost at a rate of 40 to 50 million consumers being added or becoming internet users any given year between now and then. And today, as we speak, there are about 600 to 650 million internet users. And this is one massive defining trend because the opportunities are aplenty with this kind of a digitally savvy population we're talking about. And when you go from internet to e-commerce is significant. And before that also, when we're talking about this additional 500 million users, we see that they're going to be a very different population. And there are big implications as companies when we look to target each of them. If you look at the additional 500 million, 90% of them are going to use or access internet in vernacular languages and not in English. About 60% of them will be in rural India, and they'll be coming from there. And you'll have a higher proportion of the greater than 25 and greater than 35 age group that is actually coming through amongst the next 500 million of shoppers. These are internet users. If you look at e-commerce and how it's grown, again, this is comparison to several other countries. This is pre-COVID. You will see that India has seen amazing growth, 36% year on year, but we can argue it's on a small base. And today the penetration of e-commerce is at about 3.5%. So the way to look at this is really over the next 5 years, we anticipate this 3.5% to be anywhere between 8 to 10%. And especially, given COVID, there is a pull forward of the adoption that we are seeing across multiple categories. So lots of internet users, heavy headroom in terms of e-commerce adoption is kind of where we're going forward. And as I said today, there is a digital funnel. We spoke about 600 to 650 million on internet today. A lot of them actually are into chat and social media still. Then you have, people who use YouTube, people who use Hotstar and TikTok and all of that video content. And then, it comes down to product transactors. So there's a very clear funnel here. And in some of our research, what we've seen is as people spend more time online, their propensity to start interacting with services and also to buy products over the years actually increases, which is what you see on the right-hand side. So again, heavy demand going forward. So this is the overall kind of, if I look at the 10-year view and where India macro, and it's actually, very reaffirming, especially in these times, to say that India will continue to be a bright spot. And what it means, we are the 6th largest economy in consumption terms in the world today. By 2030, if this plays out, we will be the 3rd largest, just behind US and China. So that's a phenomenal kind of next 10 years to look forward to. In terms of the trends, very quickly, I think, there are 6 of those that I'd like to highlight. And I'm sure Kamal and Dipanjan will talk more as well about this. But really, one is about the polarizing consumer needs. Unfortunately, if you look at the Gini coefficient or any kind of, metric that we look at, there is a polarization in terms of consumer needs. There's a large proportion, especially with the increasing middle class coming in, that's solving for value. But equally, there is a strong population that's looking to premiumize, that's looking to upgrade. And that polarization is something that we will be looking at. Second is about how mobile screen is the new storefront. And that's a very interesting trend. As I said, the 3.5% penetration of e-commerce today will go only up to 8 to 10%. It's going to be largely traditional trade led in India. But the influence that digital is going to have, whether it's on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, or the influence that the mobile screen is going to have on purchase is going to be far, far higher than the 8 to 10% that we are talking about. Third, we spoke about vernacular already. Majority shoppers are going to be using internet in their vernacular language. Voice is an interesting one because a lot of them we will see, whether it's the cab drivers, whether it's the maids, whether a lot of them are much more comfortable talking, whether it's Google Maps for the cab drivers, whether it's Google search. And so voice is going to become a very critical trend. And so is video, as we are already seeing with short form, long form that's actually there in the country. Fourth is about how this, especially driven by Gen Z and millennials, how they're looking or craving for hyper-personalization. It's all about me. I want it very customized to what I need. I want convenience. And that is another very powerful theme, which was very much prevalent even pre-COVID. Fifth, I won't spend much time. I think this group is very, very cognizant of that about many Indias. And this is one where, in just working with multiple companies, I've seen even the best of companies sometimes do not disaggregate this and look at different techniques and why it's not working. And just appreciating this and tailoring our solutions, tailoring our marketing per the very different needs and preferences goes, it becomes very critical. The last one is an interesting one. I'm sure you've heard of WeChat in China. The entire life runs around WeChat. You chat, you order stuff, you call your cab through that, you do everything. India is not there yet, but we believe that there is a very clear networked ecosystem that's forming. And there are different ecosystems actually that are emerging, whether it's Amazon ecosystem, whether it's a Reliance ecosystem, whether it's a Walmart, Flipkart ecosystem, where you start seeing multiple things, shopping, payments, video, engagement. There are so many of those that actually form. So this is another interesting trend, that's to kind of look for and what consumers are looking to. If I talk about COVID and what's happened to all of these, again, at this point, I will confess that this is an assumption based at this stage. What we are seeing some of these, and we'll have to see, which is why the question mark on the right. But some of the trends we're picking up is, we believe that a few of these are just short-term sentiment-driven changes. And these are things which will correct itself over 3 years, 4 years, or even, much sooner. And depending on several factors, the vaccine coming in, what's the general, there's so many factors around that. One of those I would start with is a savings first mindset. We saw this during the greater, the financial crisis in 2009. And we see that it took about 3-4 years for the investment assets in which people are actually spending their money to change and go back. But that's what we saw then. We'll have to see what's happening here. And also some deferred spending on the non-essential high ticket items. So luxury and all of those. There will be a deferred spending. But we believe that this is again a short-term sentiment and something that will come back up in a few years. The second interesting one is the consolidation of baskets and shopping trips. I think India is very famous for how we split our shopping basket across so many different vendors. And we also split across multiple shopping trips. On my fresh, if I take FMCG as an example, my fresh, I will wait for the telewala and pick up from there. I'll go pick up on Monday, I'll go to a big bazaar on Tuesday. So this is how we actually split our basket. We are seeing increasingly that people are spending more and shopping fewer times, but that is something that will course correct. Some of the prior trends we spoke about, digital adoption, preference for value, quality consciousness, and this whole increased focus on health, hygiene, and wellness. All of these, we believe, COVID has only acted as an accelerant, and also in terms of increase in experimentation, whether the consumers are open to new brands, consumers are open to new channels, and they're willing to try out. So I think that is something that we see a rapid acceleration happening, due to COVID. And there are a few, again, debatable about tectonic shifts, what could happen. We believe that it's going to take the whole out-of-home consumption, and Giri is the expert on that, he can talk more about it. But we believe that and the domestic and foreign travel is going to see a very different shape going forward, right? We'll have to, and of course, companies will be innovative, cater to that, but we feel that it's going to look different from what it was pre-COVID. And similarly, the other one about omni and O2O, I think that blurring of lines is going to happen, and it is going to be consumers fragmenting their paths to purchase, and really omni is going to be much more seamless than what it is today. I'll close with this page, which is really what are some of the implications for us, having listened to all of this as CFOs. I think what I would kind of say is the first one is really around the huge potential in India. Let's not lose sight of that in the next 18 months. The next 10 years, we are talking about the economy that's going to be the third largest consumption economy in the world. So that is important. And when we do this analysis, every 10 years, there is some crisis or the other that we have seen. If you take a larger 40-year kind of view, of different kind of, intensity. But what we see is that whether it's the stock price you look at or it's the fundamentals that you look at, the difference between winners and losers becomes much wider during these times of crisis. So not losing sight of this and using this as an opportunity would be the first one, I would say. Second is truly the story of frontline heroes. I'm sure each one of us has these remarkable stories of what the frontline person has done, to kind of serve the consumer even during these very trying times. And I've had the fortune of talking to a lot of CEOs across sectors. Everyone had a phenomenal story of how they delivered despite, all of these constraints. The thing we need to do is figure that out and say that really tells us what is true full potential. It is not what we sit in the boardroom and we look at to say, is it X person CAGR? What are we going to do? It is truly that if that individual could do it during these trying times, is that opening up new business models for us? Is that truly kind of opening up very different ways of working? Is it talking about efficiency? So that learning that to say what more can we do to understand true full potential becomes critical. Third is actually a quote I'm borrowing from one of the CEOs, Saugata, of Marico, and he mentioned this. He said, it's amazing how my company is now an insurgent company, like a startup. What can I do to bottle up this genie and keep it like this forever? And I think that's a fascinating insight that was there. So there are different ways, and again, Kaval and Dipanjan can talk more about it, but how do we bottle up this insurgent trend we have seen in each of our companies and make sure that that's our DNA going forward? Fourth, spoken a lot about digital and data as a moat and how would we do? And really we talk about the new normal, but being prepared for a new abnormal is probably the way to go. And how do we really think about scenario planning, right? The forecasts are not the same. I've spoken to multiple CFOs who are talking about, let's wait till the end of the year. Let's wait till next year. These plans are very dynamic. And I think true scenario planning about what could happen, what are the uncertainties we are up against, and being able to plan for that becomes very critical. I'll pause with that and hand it over back to Guru.
No, thank you. Thank you, Shyam. I think this was an excellent insights on the macro consumer trends, actually. Why don't I pass on to Kaval for his insights, seeing as a venture capitalist and how we see some of these things translating into new business opportunities and things. Why don't I pass it on to you, Kaval?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Giri. And great presentation, Shyam. I'm glad we decided not to do a presentation through slides because we would have fallen way short of the gold standard that Shyam has put up. So in a way, Shyam has actually captured the macro and even several trends which we are seeing at the grassroots level very, very succinctly in the presentation. So what I'll try and do is, wrap some additional thoughts around what we are seeing, especially in the new age brand or the millennial brands, as we call them, just to highlight how some of the trends that he has mentioned and bring some of these examples to life and what's happening on the ground. And then I'll hand over to my colleague Dipanjan to flesh out a little more into some of the specifics which we wanted to talk about around, role of technology, how capital is becoming a very multi-dimensional opportunity, especially for the forum that is attending here. So let me start by actually, pretty much painting the same picture that Shyam mentioned, but from the lens of a startup or from the lens of a early stage company. Again, Giri, you kindly introduced me. I started my career with Hindustan Lever, so I had 10 years of experience of how large brands look at the market, what kind of drivers of growth and opportunity are there. What I was seeing over the last 5, 7, 8 years was a fairly seminal or a tectonic shift in the way consumers were aspiring for and looking for brands. And again, Shyam referred to this as the whole demographic change and how it moved from the Eiffel Tower to the pyramid to the diamond. And that trend was getting captured, especially in the younger generation who were more digitally smart, who were savvy, who had global access to information and who were demanding new choices. And one of the big barriers to that opportunity for new brands to emerge was obviously a combination of both the complexity of distribution in India, because India is still a very large, mom and pop general trade type of distribution market. And obviously the commensurate amount of marketing and advertising dollars that need to be spent to be able to cater to this broadly what I would call a mass market. Now, the big change that we started seeing in the last 7, 8 years was that there was this whole digital infrastructure which was starting to come in, and they started influencing a slightly different approach to how brands could be built. Whether it was talking to consumers in a more personalized manner to build communities through influencers, through online media channels like Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, etc., or the advent of some of the large e-commerce players, the Flipkarts, the Amazons, and the big baskets of the world. And that opportunity actually was the first, I would say, baby step that we started seeing in the space of new consumer brands. So my journey in the consumer brand space as an investor started with a bunch of brands where I invested what I would call the first wave of new age brands, which created new propositions, but were still relatively on the same business model as the larger brands. So let me take examples of ID Fresh, which is into idli dosa batter and parathas and so on. It's a ready to cook business. Paperboat, which is into ethnic juices. Epigamia, which is into Greek yogurt and dairy-based products. So these are all very exciting new ideas, new brands, but fundamentally on the platform of what I would call the traditional way of building brands, which is more distribution-led, more offline, and building a strong consumer connect through more traditional channels. Obviously, digital media being one of their additional channels, but still pretty much on the lines of what was earlier. The next wave, which we have seen in the last 4 to 5 years, is really the first attempt for brands to be what we call digital first or D2C brands. So these are companies like Mama Earth, like Boat, like Licious, and there are several others in the market today, who started with a DNA of saying, we want to start building our business as a brand which is talking to the consumer and reaching the consumer digitally first. So it's not that they will either never go into a omni-channel or an offline mode, or they don't already do it, but the DNA of the business is very different. And I think that's an important point to add to what Shyam was saying, is even for larger companies, and Marico is a great example because we work very closely. Harsh Mariwala is an investor in our fund. He's on our advisory board. Saugata, we talk to pretty much on a regular basis. And the whole conversation is around how can you create these DNAs within large organizations, which can help to address this situation of, in a mindset, what is a digital first brand? So how do you conceptualize your entire product roadmap? What are the guardrails within which you will create new products? How fast do you test them? Rapid prototyping, fast failing, trying out different experiments. That's not the DNA of a large company. And I've been in one of them, so I know that. So that is the second interesting learning for us, which happened in the last 4 or 5 years as we have traversed the journey of Fireside. And the last piece, which is really becoming interesting, and again, Shyam briefly alluded to that, is how can you integrate technology into the overall business, not just technology of being online, or not just technology of supply chain and back-end processes, but technology in the business models themselves. Let me take one example of a company that we have invested in, which is a very young company, literally less than 1 year old. It's a company called Gynoveda. What they do is they have basically created a range of Ayurvedic products to address specifically women's menstrual health problems. And the whole business model is predicated on engaging that woman, who could be a young girl, who could be a more middle-aged woman, or even later in life, to talk to them on their website. Through a series of question and answers and through a chat bot, you are able to actually engage and diagnose what kind of problem that person, that lady is facing, and recommend a specific product which can help her. Now imagine, for a subject like menstrual health, it's a very taboo subject. Even young girls may not even talk to their mothers or their families. So suddenly you have a, anonymous but friendly partner who can talk to you, who can come on even live chats, who can advise you and then give you solutions for that. No, we are seeing that across food and beverages, whether it's nutrition, whether it's immunity, whether it's health, supplements, nutraceuticals. We are seeing it across personal care and beauty. Like this one example I mentioned, there are several other cases where people can diagnose specific problems which are related to skin, hair, etc., and recommend products which are unique to your solution. So that's the other very interesting trend that we are starting to see in the startup universe. And to summarize what COVID has done, it's actually added a lot of weight behind this trend in a positive way. So I won't repeat a lot of what Shyam said. In fact, all of what he said is almost like, he was writing our fundraise thesis because we recently closed a fund and, pretty much on the lines of what Shyam was mentioning. But suffice it to say that e-commerce and digital transactions is getting more and more mainstream. We are seeing a very large population of across the segments of people adopting this new trend. The trust that companies seek from brands, and again, I mentioned Licious earlier. Licious is a company which supplies fresh meat home delivered in 90 minutes, and they are across, I think, about 10 cities now across the country. They have seen a 2.5, 3 times growth in their business post-COVID in the last June, July, August months. Because suddenly, first of all, consumers are locked at home. They need to do, things at home, which, make some more exciting, opportunities in their, daily routine. And cooking together and, doing stuff together is obviously one of them. So we see, ID, Tasty Tales, Licious, all of these ready-to-cook companies have picked up. But even more important is the worry around hygiene, the worry around, where you are buying that product from. And suddenly, for a packaged good like Licious, although it's fresh meat, that benchmark becomes very, very high, and consumers are not willing to go to the local butchery and start buying products there. So that's another example of a trend which we think is a seminal trend which will not go away just because COVID finishes, but people's consciousness around awareness. So just to kind of summarize, we believe, again, endorsing what Shyam said, consumption in India is going to be a very different ball game. The shape of the consumption is going to change. There is going to be a more personalized, more digitally enabled consumption pattern that we will see. And all companies in their own right are adopting and working on how to address this situation. Obviously, as an investor in young startups in the consumer space, our focus is very well defined. But I can tell you, because our investors include companies like ITC and Unilever and L'Oreal, etc. All of them are in this realm of how do we take advantage and build stronger businesses around this digital ecosystem. Let me pause here. I'll just invite Dipanjan to share a couple of thoughts on both use of technology, because that's one area which might interest some of the audience, but even more important, some of the very almost dynamic changes we have seen in how capital is being used, both from efficiency and from types of capital to build these companies, which may be an interesting area for all of you to understand. Dipanjan, handing over to you.
Thanks, Kaval. Yeah, as I was going through Shyam's presentation, it was occurring to me as well that it's almost a fun presentation we are seeing ourselves. So we're glad we didn't make a presentation. So let me cover 2-3 aspects of just what Kaval mentioned, and specifically taking few aspects of what Shyam had put out in his presentation on data and AI and stuff like that. So one big shift, and I'm covering the technology part first, which we have seen post-March as the lockdown happened, that everybody was hustling, everybody was trying to figure out, how to do things better. But effectively, most of the portfolio companies whom we work with, in fact, all of them, they used technology, and especially digital technology, which is either personalization, AI, or anything which they can do to reach the consumer in a smarter manner. Remember, post pre-COVID, starting and running a D2C company was not very cheap in India. Because the amount of cost which you spend on a Google and a Facebook is actually quite high. But that changed, and it did changed not only because the cost of Google and Facebook came down, it changed also because people became more innovative. In fact, just sharing a interesting data point that one of the largest e-grocer in India, who was doing a certain GMV and a certain burn before COVID, has actually come back to a similar level of revenues and GMV with 1/10 the burn. And I was talking to their CFO, and I was asking whether if it is because of higher demand, whether it is because of higher consumer paying more, etc., etc. And the answer was actually none of these. It's just that before COVID, people believe that there is a capital which is available at all the time. You just need to ask how much you need to spend on marketing, and there'll be a fundraise which you'll be assured of in the next 6 to 12 months. Now that certainty went away, and people actually became more innovative. And that innovation was in terms of how do you reach out to your consumers using social media, using various mediums in which the consumer today reside, and reach out to them with your products. I think this has to us been a big revolution, which could almost like a restart of e-commerce, if I will, from a standpoint that we saw e-commerce changing the way distribution happened 10 years back. This is how the brands will start emerging. And it is not to mention only new brands. And Marico is a great example. I think tomorrow a Marico or an ITC or a Unilever, they would actually disintermediate their respective operations into smaller groups and say, hey, can I, work in microorganisms and grow it like a startup. I think this has been a very, very big, big area. Few interesting examples is the whole area about personalization. So we have a fashion company in our portfolio, and fashion is actually the most impacted category during COVID. I mean, a lot of fashion companies have shut down. Offline fashion is completely, down still. So here is a woman workwear company. Workwear is actually even more down compared to fashion because nobody is going to work anymore. But here the founders, again, being very, very smart about it, used technology, used the kind of design sensibilities which are going around in the market, using data to see what's working, what's not working, used a very fast fashion mechanism to churn out completely new set of ranges, which is available from work from home. And all of this in a matter of 2 months that we talk about between May and June and July and August. And using personalization, which means that a person A coming onto the website will see a different page, and a person B coming to the website will see a different page. Now, all of these actually becomes very essential when you want to increase conversion. We are working with very finite and very small set of customer eventually in a cash constrained environment. You're not spending a huge amount of cash to open the top of the funnel. So you have to be innovative on technology at each level to be able to therefore maximize the conversions at each step. Similarly, we have a yoga and fitness company called Sarva Yoga, which actually have seen a change of fortune from shutting their entire yoga studios, which were offline, moving to a completely digital first online wellness tech company, which now gives online yoga, which gives online, the whole range of mindfulness, meditation, mental wellness, etc., etc. And including, they have very interesting technology where actually while doing yoga through a video, you can actually have a two-way interaction. So there's a gamification. Now that technology is not easy, and there are a bunch of young engineers in Bangalore who is actually still working on it. But whatever we have seen, it looks very, very interesting and very, very futuristic, where you can actually see from a still video whether you are actually doing the poses correct or not. It will show percentages, it will show green, red, yellow, etc., etc. So in effect, in all of these examples, what comes out, that be it the product, be it the market, customer reach, be it the back-end supply chain, and the whole end-to-end of what we call as what we need to run the company, there is deep, deep technology now getting embedded everywhere. Content and commerce coming closer than ever before. People who have been only selling have been talking a lot about their product and therefore creating a community. Customers wanting to know more, they are wanting to see what they are eating, they are seeing the back of pack. And that's a very, very healthy change. It's a very, very healthy change from a consumer behavior standpoint. So these are some of the trends on the technology stand. On the capital side, I will just go back to the starting point where I said that the burn rate had gone down 1/10 for an e-grocer. Actually, that has been the most important outcome, if at all, we have seen coming out of the COVID pandemic in a positive manner. I'm sure a lot of large companies have taken down on a lot of cost-cutting measures and stuff like that. But a lot of small startups were actually normally used to operate on a high burn model, and the capital efficiencies of raising money and deploying it and growing, that cycle has been quite rampant over the last few years. Now that is changing and has changed for sure. We are seeing the brands which Kaval just spoke about, and a number of our portfolio companies are almost very, very high contribution margins and gross margins. Moment they touch 50, 100 crore revenue run rate, they're almost EBITDA profitable. Sometimes they are working capital negative. And this pandemic has, taught everybody that if I'm not able to raise the next round of funding, I should be able to grow comfortably. Yes, I may not be able to grow very, very fast, but I will not be in a position to, I will not be required to shut down the company or something like that. I think that realization has been set in very, very deep, and the capital efficiency, of the businesses have gone, very, very high. And in that context, what we have been using and working with our companies, and which could be relevant from a overall, capital structuring model standpoint for a retail company, is use of MSME debt. I think MSME debt itself has not been the greatest liquidity creator in the market yet. But with little which the government has done so far with the reduction of repo rates, etc., a lot of the companies have been able to raise short-term debt. We are seeing some green shoots in NBFCs, in venture. There are a lot of good venture debt companies which are coming up. There are banks like HDFC, RBL, etc., who are being more supportive on the startup ecosystem and giving short-term debt, depending upon the strength of the company's forecast, etc., etc. And with the right amount of debt and equity, we feel this actually increases the runway of the company. And during these times when the equity raising can be actually quite tougher, intermediate debt raise can actually be very, very beneficial. So a combination of all of that and the overall ecosystem that both Shyam and Kaval talked about, we are fortunately seeing more green than reds, and we hope it remains so.
Very good. Hello?
Yeah, Giri, you can. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dipanjan. I think that was a very nice perspective from both you and Kaval. I think I'll just spend a couple of minutes in talking about our own experience at Indian Hotels, because Indian Hotels is a very consumer company in terms of how we deal with our customers, and it's a 115-year-old company. And I think while you and Kaval focused around what the new startup world is kind of doing, I think what is important for people like us is that some of these trends were very apparent to us even before the pandemic. and how we have been pivoting. We are starting to pivot post the pandemic in different ways. And I think I have a question from Siddharth who says that, will there be a shift in domestic and international travel? Will there be a shift in business travel? Of course, I think some of these shifts, I don't know if they're going to be tectonic as a question mark that Shyam put up, but definitely I think in the short run, business travel, international travel are definitely going to be impacted. And we talk of a world which is before vaccine and after vaccine. But what we see is that the fact that premiumization is a very big trend, and trust. I think Kaval spoke about trust of brands. I think we are a hugely trusted company. And I think what we are now seeing is that with the trust that we have, with the heritage that we have, I think we are now beginning to pivot. One of the first things we have done in a very visible way is fine dining being home delivered. Many of our customers said, can I get my food from Golden Dragon or from Karavali or from Blue Ginger or from one of the other restaurants that they eat out? And we started something called Cumin. We deliberately called it Cumin. It is a very important brand decision not to use the word Taj, but to use the word Cumin actually. And you know what? I do not, and I've been telling my investors that suddenly we are doing, we have started it about a month and a half back. We see it already at 10 lakhs a day kind of brand actually, which means it can easily be a 100 crore to 150 crore brand in the next couple of years actually. Out of nowhere, a company like a Taj, which prided itself in welcoming guests to the table and serving them what they wanted. We today have a brand which can be a 150 crore brand in the next couple of years actually. Something that we would not have thought of before the pandemic. And I think pandemic is forcing us to think that actually. Completely new way of looking at business actually. And in terms of digitization, clearly some of the trends on revenue management, accessing customers had already started, and these are only going to get accelerated actually. So I think, and you talked about capital, Dipanjan. I think capital is not just a challenge for startups. I think even for large companies like us, I think investors do talk about return on capital employed actually. So we have been going asset light as well. So combination of an asset light model, combination of digital models, combination of doing some things like human, and really rethinking our consumers in very different ways and accessing them through social media, all that we spoke about, we're doing all of that actually. And I think you will see next 3-4 years, we will be a very different company in terms of how we manage and operate actually. Personally, of course, I've seen some of the stories, you've spoken about some of the stories. I have been an angel investor and I've seen some of the trends that you have spoken about play through. You know, for instance, in a company that I've invested is Nikki, which is in a vernacular mobile, voice-based e-commerce, you know, very exciting to see that voice-based e-commerce vernacular kind of takes off. You know, so there are examples like that. There's another company called Red Sky, started by some of your former colleagues in Hindustan Lever, young colleagues who kind of have given AC Nielsen a run for their money in terms of traditional trade analytics actually. So I think there is such fascinating work which is going on actually. So I will stop here in terms of talking more about what we're doing. I think one of the questions that I had maybe for, let's go back to Shyam actually. As you work with companies, I think you laid out a very nice macro picture, and I think Kaval and Dipanjan spoke about the startup ecosystem. As you work with larger companies, which are kind of pivoting and segueing actually into this consumption-led growth phenomenon actually, how do you see the large companies dealing with it actually? Because many of the audience today are CFOs of larger companies actually. And I think it'll be useful to hear from you, Shyam, as well as from you, Kaval, in terms of what you see large companies doing in this space.
Absolutely. So I think, Giri, the number one I would say is, what Kaval also spoke about in terms of, I'll call it the whole bottling up the insurgency, which is, I think, typically what happens is this, we have grown to learn that once you have scale, speed is compromised. And I think the best companies basically try and make sure that it's not a compromise, but how can both actually work together, right? So in my mind, what they essentially do, there are different ways of doing it. So some companies, for example, we spoke about Marico. There are so many such. Either they have their own internal VCs that we are seeing, and we are seeing this across the sector, spectrum. We have large industrial companies that are actually setting up their own, kind of VC network internally, looking at what the next bright idea could be, what the engine 2 could be, and investing. So I think that's one that we've seen people do. There are some where we're seeing this notion of micro battles, which is saying that it is not the traditional hierarchical structure that we follow. Take a cross-functional team, somebody from innovation, somebody from sales, somebody from marketing, somebody from business finance, put them together and say that the problem you need to solve is how do we gain share back in Orissa, for this particular product. So being able to break it down to what we call a micro battle is a critical one. And the most, kind of sparse talent that exists, that does not exist as much today, is this talent of scalers, which is you need that cross-functional team that will go deliver on that pilot, make it supremely successful. Then you need this talented person called a scaler who is going to take that and say, now, how can I do the same thing across products in Orissa? Or how can I do the same thing across different markets like Orissa or take it forward? So I believe that there are two things. One, kind of actually embody or imbibe the fact that there are great engine 2 ideas out there. How do we partner? How do we learn from them? And what do we do? And there are lots of cross-functional things that you can essentially do. And the other one is this notion of micro battles, cross-functional, and scaling. These are the two that we are picking up from some of the really good companies.
Yeah, and do you see boards kind of getting active here? Do you see, I mean, you talked about scenario plannings. Are people looking at strategic plans, annual plans differently because of some of these trends, actually?
Absolutely, Giri. I think that's a very good point. In fact, I do a lot of work within the consumer products retail e-commerce space. And there are so many things. I mean, the amount of disruption we know that is going on. So I think there is a lot of this whole notion of strategy in uncertainty is taking a lot of prominence from boards. So boards are also very comfortable with saying that, I am not looking for a 3-year plan that does not move. In fact, I would go to the extent of saying that's being very myopic or that's being short-sighted at some level. Boards are encouraging us to say, have you truly understood what the bookends could be? And then let's talk about, if this plays out, what are you going to do? What are the markers and what would you do? So it's a great point, Giri. We see that a lot of interest from at least some of the companies I work with. Boards are very interested. And I've seen sessions where the leadership team is cooped up pretty much for a day. And they do the scenario planning exercises where one plays the competitor, one plays this, and the entire. So it's actually a very, as just an observer of strategy and a student of strategy, it's an exciting phase to be in.
Very good. No, very good. I think I will go to Kaval. I think one of the things that I've been fascinated with is the role of the government in terms of enabling some of it. And I sort of spoke about it briefly in the beginning, Aadhaar and NPCI and the MSME platforms and Jandan accounts and all that. How do you see, better government, do you see in your work, Kaval, as you work with companies in terms of public-private partnerships, and some of these things really getting fast-tracked, actually, in terms of driving and the implications, therefore, for companies, opportunities for them to get into?
Sure. So maybe I can just give a few pointers, and actually Dipanjan has been working with some of these organizations much closer, so I'll also put them in the conversation. So what we are seeing is that there is a very strong growing awareness, and I guess accelerated because of the COVID situation, of the government's keenness to engage and work with the, as you called it, the MSME sector. And obviously, there is a large body at SIDBI which is got a fund of funds which they invest in funds like ours, as well as, they do a lot of different specific programs which are targeted towards MSMEs. So what we have found is that the interest level of engaging with us and working with funds like ourselves has been significantly increased in the last few years. So much so that in my first fund, when we were starting out, we closed the fund. We did not have any money from SIDBI, but this time, it was a very proactive relationship with them in the way they function, and they are, taken a fairly large part of our overall fund as almost like a boost for us to be able to work with these startups. And the response and the engagement level of the team on the ground has been very proactive. So again, Dipanjan is the key point of contact, so he can add more color to it. Second is that at the point of COVID, they actually came up with a special scheme for giving soft loans to MSMEs. And several of our companies have applied, and we have seen actually a fairly positive, proactive response They even had people from the VC and private equity industry on their investment committee so that they could analyze, young startups as potential targets for soft loans, because the benchmarks will be very different than, typically what you would look at in a more, mature company or in a bank kind of a scenario. So that's the second building block that we have seen happening. And the third is a lot of engagement. So, our industry bodies like India Venture Capital Association and, some of the other IT bodies like NASSCOM, etc., they have been continuously working with the government to highlight some of these issues and, policies around, for example, how do you deal with a large organization at a time when the business is completely, shut down, and, what are the guardrails? There was a lot of lack of clarity in the beginning. Can you reduce salaries? Can you, find some ways of managing the burn as the businesses are growing? So I would say a lot of proactive, desire to make it work. What we have found is, identify a few specific areas that, are highest impact, and then go deep on them. So, so our engagement with SIDBI probably is our, most active partnership that I can, call out. And maybe Dipanjan, you can add a few thoughts around how that whole relationship has got built out even deeper.
Yeah, sure, Kawal. No, I think we covered pretty well. Just one additional point is on this whole MSME scheme itself, where in the whole definition of startup, 100 crore size, etc. I think the lot of public sector banks have lot of dry powder, like a lot, meaning a lot of dry powder to be able to deploy liquidity. Now, the last step is, I think that's where the bottleneck is, where the disbursements still, I would say, has not started to happen at that pace, because still there are questions around viability of some of the companies, the financial health of the companies, and especially we are coming off, just before COVID, of a lot of NPAs and bad management and stuff like that. So they're also being marred by a lot of that past. I think if you're able to take a clean view of it, and I think last time Mr. KK Mistry also covered at the last webinar. He was also talking also about how the NBFCs and when they start to lend, and they get that extra support and buffer from from the regulators. That circulation, when it starts come, then the mid-sized companies will start to manage. What's happening right now is that SIDBI, as Kawal mentioned, is one big body who is more helping from the startup fund ecosystem standpoint. It's still possibly not reaching the mid-tier companies or the semi-large companies who need debt and so on and so forth. They have a large debt scheme as well, right? They can actually disburse a large sum of money. But again, if the financials are not strong, it is still not that the disbursements are very, very high. But as Kawal mentioned, we have seen significant positive interest. So it's not that, like what we've been used to seeing earlier, that, you make an excuse and you use that excuse to not disburse a loan. So it's not that they want to make it happen. They want to genuinely help. They have goals of disbursements, which is helpful. It's a question of then the final execution and how do you really, that is taking some time, but it will get through, I would say.
Very good. Very good. Thank you, Dipanjan. I think we have Sanjeev Churiwala with us. He's the CFO of Diageo. I think for a company which sells the best of booze globally, and I can say that I was working with them. I think it'll be nice to hear Sanjeev in terms of how they see the world of beverages moving and what steps they are taking in terms of participating in that. Over to you, Sanjeev.
Thanks a lot, Girian, and thanks, Pranjal, for putting me in the spot. I was supposed to be an attendee here, but nonetheless, it was a pleasure hearing you Shyam, Kanwal, Dipanjal, because most of the trains discussion that you had in the last almost an hour, I can just reflect back and see the same exactly happening in my business. To give some perspective for most of the attendees, India business is big, about close to 20,000 crores. We operate across 50 manufacturing facilities. We are the #1 player in India and globally, presents about 180 countries. Of course, India brings its own shares of idiosyncrasies, as we all know, the way it operates. So we were under a complete lockdown for almost close to 1.5 months. And our business was completely shut, just like Giri's business, right? And we had no option but to kind of just bite our nails. And once things opened up around 4th of May, if you're all aware, right, in the social media, one big joke was picking up saying, after the great China wall, the second thing that is visible now from the moon is the big, lines across all the booth shops throughout India. And that was a fact. People have been queuing up for hours and hours. We have seen it ourselves, right? And it was a mad rush, just catering to the pent-up demand. But I think, over the last 6 months now, we have seen sizable consumer shift in terms of the trends and as well as shift in the leadership behavior. I like to kind of point out that because I think it's very unique for us. Just to give the perspective, whatever sale we do in India, 20% plus is on trade. So Giri stays to be a big consumer for us. Unfortunately, is not buying enough right nowadays, but that's a reality. So a couple of big shift that we have seen, and this has taken us by surprise, frankly speaking. We have seen a huge shift from an on-trade consumption to a home consumption. The home consumption occasions have been increasing by mind-boggling CAGR, right? And there are more and more new ways of home consumption, which is moving up. Second is just like the e-commerce trend. Our industry never had home delivery, and suddenly the state governments realized that they cannot survive without allowing home deliveries for the alcohol beef. Now, as a result, we see a sudden surge in a lot of players like Swiggy and other people coming up, government coming up with their own apps, the local stores coming up with their own app, because it's a matter of survival for them. Because if they and still, India has a large number of hotspots and then many shops which are kind of closed physically, but they can still catering through this home service delivery. That occasions is really growing. In spite of all the noises, premiumization trade still continues, right? People who consumes a Johnny Walker will continue to drink a Johnny Walker. They will not down trade, right? We had our own apprehensions that people might start, depremiumizing, but that never happened, and it's very clear this trend will only going to pick up. Big trend that everyone is catering to, and we are also catering to. Consumers are experimenting big time at home now, right? I've seen consumers who were only consuming whiskey earlier now calling up and saying, hey, can you tell us the good brands in rum, good brands in gin? Can you help us with new mixes? So people have good time at home and kind of they're experimenting in the evening like never before. And in a way, this is good because it is just not our segment. It also opens up opportunity for many other segments. Earlier, we used to cater to social occasions on big occasions, and we had a vertical kind of catering to them. And suddenly we realized that social occasion can also come in small packages, and this trend is really picking up because of all the prohibitions and whatnot. People are still assembling. It's maybe a group of 10, 20, 30 people, right? Social occasions, and it's not stopping. It's not really visible to us when we look around. It may be kind of in closed doors, but the social occasions are just going up phenomenally, and we are really struggling to cater to them because they have unique requirements. They have tailor-made requirements, right? They come to us, say, hey, give me whiskey, that's fine. Give me mixers, that's fine. Give me a bartender if you can, and a nice bartender who can come and teach us 5 different kind of mixes. So I think the tailor-made occasions are going up, and which is good for us because that's helping us in the premiumization journey. A lot of niche investment in alcohol space. A lot of private equity investments are coming up there. Maybe Kanwal and you'll have a better idea. But we have seen investments coming up in craft gin categories, in mixes, in capturing home occasions in whichever way and whichever format it happens. And then our feel is this change in trend. It's just not limited to alcohol beef. Of course, we'll have our own peculiarities. but it's going to happen across various categories. And people who can actually go and capture these home occasions are the ones who will actually capture market shares and do well going forward. Mm. There's shift in buying. People like you and me who might have gone to the stores maybe twice or thrice a week. Now we feel, hey, it's not safe to go thrice a week. Let's just go once a week, buy big SKUs, buy big formats, right? Do enough storing for the next 15 days or a month, stock it up. And we're trying to, find ways to cater to this new ways of consumption. The last and the very important factor, which kind of I also picked up from your conversations, rural and developing economy, in our sense, is booming and ahead of the urban in terms of the consumption that we see right now. When we do a deep dive, we see many reasons. I think people do have deep pockets. Rural is not that badly impacted. Consumptions are still high. Schemes like Manrega and other things have really put money into the pockets of the rural, right? And they're still spending, they're still consuming, and they're still having fun, right? And hence, we are catering to this through our popular segments, but that trend is big and picking up. So that was the key shift we saw in the consumer side. But I think in terms of the mindset, the behavior from the leadership, again, there has been a big change in the way we look things. We have stopped thinking about budgets, right? As someone of you said, we no more do a yearly budget, do a yearly monthly comparisons, and try and find faults, what has gone wrong, gone right. We have moved to a quarterly mechanism, and earlier our KPIs used to be a long list, but not. We have just thrown everything out of the window, and we're kind of just considering only on 2 KPIs. Won't believe it, only 2 KPIs. Number one, what kind of market share are we gaining? Nothing else. We're not talking about cash flows, profits, sales, premiumizations, whatnot. Simple. This is the time that we have to leap forward as one of the largest players in the market and ensure that we have a big leap in the market share, which is saying when people are buying more, can we participate more? Very clearly. Second big shift is people are buying better, as you said, Shyam. So how do we participate in the premiumization journey, and what are the benchmarks for that? What are the yardsticks? And third, very clearly, buying new and buying better, or buying new rather. People are wanting fresh feel, new liquid, new taste. So the third most important factor we are now applying is the 33% of my KPI is what kind of renovations I can do in the marketplace today. Can I quickly launch a craft beer 1 month down the line, which normally takes me 8 months, from the inception to kind of putting the liquid in the marketplace. Now we're saying everything flat in 1 month. We have 180 markets to operate with. Can I go to this market, pick up something which is similar to my requirement over here, and just start filling up the shops? And this new way of working and thinking has completely taken up traditional way of thinking, right? So agility is the key word, right? I think the PE mindset is something that we talk about a lot, right? And the sprints that we can do for various of these activities, we have moved a lot on that. I think one big thing that we have now started doing, which you used to do earlier on a yearly basis, do a WOT planning, what the competition is doing, how are they behaving, what the key shift. We cannot wait for another 1 year. That's happening now every month. Every month they're sitting across the table and say, hey, what is the big changes that has happened, and how are we changing ourselves, and how are we participating on these occasions? So in short and sweet, Giridhar, this is what I have to say.
Yeah. No, very good. Thank you, Sanjeev, for that perspective of what Diageo is doing to pivot into this system. I think I have one question from, I think this is Saurabh, who was asking Kawal. This is 80 billion of dry powder based on IVCA data on India-focused funds. And what can be done to fast-track deployment to accelerate the consumption-led growth? So that's the question from Saurabh for Kawal.
Sure. I think what we are starting to see is that the scope of where the private equity and venture money is going is becoming more and more, mainstream across many different categories. And what originally 10 years ago e-commerce was the big drive, then fintech became the next big one, then now education or edtech is the other one. But as you can see that the reach of private equity and venture capital money is almost reaching every aspect of where we are seeing potential for growth. One area that I feel will be a significantly high area of additional investment, and obviously we have seen some mega $1 billion going into that, is the whole retail and distribution infrastructure. Of course, Geo has sounded the bugle and raised 20s of billions of dollars in the last few months with COVID and everything else notwithstanding. So I feel that infrastructure is probably, and infrastructure, I don't necessarily mean only the physical infrastructure of roads and ports and airports, etc., which obviously is happening at a different level. But I mean consumption driving infrastructure, where retail is one big part of it, e-commerce is another big part of it, payment infrastructure is another big part of it. Because once these mega, pipes or mega roadways, if I may, get built, then the demand for products and the ability of more and more new products and new brands to come in becomes that much more interesting. So, like Shyam said, if we have to go from 3.4, 3.5% e-commerce penetration to closer to 10%, that is a very, very large number. And that will give rise to huge amount of additional demand for new products, new ideas, new consumption, new brands. And for that, the infrastructure. So to me, that positive spiral, which already we are seeing, obviously Geo has taken the lead on that, but we have heard about Amazon now getting into Reliance Retail, already in more, all kinds of attempts being made, Walmart, Flipkart becoming, so 3 or 4 big players pumping in, like 20, 30, 40 billion dollars into creating a very strong, I call it a retail infrastructure, is really the most exciting, opportunity. And more, on the business side, the SaaS businesses, the infrastructure around, providing solutions for technology, for education, healthcare will continue. And particularly, we are very excited about the health and the wellness space. And we believe that once again, that's an area which will see a lot of significant investment coming in. So what more can be done to accelerate? I feel that we are already on a very high growth path as far as some of these trends are concerned. And at least my last 20 years of being an investor, I have seen that as infrastructure comes in, we start seeing, telecom happened, so BPO happened, then the whole VAS system happened, banking system happened, then payments started getting institutionalized. E-commerce happened, so brands happened. So I think it's a very positive spiral that we are seeing in the next 10 years. Again, Shyam gave a lot of good examples, are going to be very, very interesting, not just for these mega large unicorn, deep investment businesses, but the ecosystem around that where we play, and we see hundreds, if not thousands of new brands emerging just because this infrastructure is going to enable that.
Yeah, no, very good. I will come back to the large companies because recognizing that the audience has got a number of large companies. And as we as the large companies sort of reorient their operating models, one of the challenges that at least I see in our company, and I'm sure some of my colleagues who are on this panel will see, is that talent. What does it mean? How are companies leveraging themselves on talent in terms of reskilling? What do you do with people who have worked 20 years and fantastic for the company, but how do we reskill them to the new normal as we call them, as we change it? How are they working with youngsters? What are reward systems? Because, we heard Sanjeev saying, forget about 1-year plans. We are now talking about quarterly plans, actually. What does it mean for reward systems, actually? Startups are a different animal where they have kind of grown in a certain way. But what are the learnings, Kaval and Shyam, in terms of what they can do in the whole talent space? Because that's going to be critical in all of this. Shyam, you want to kick off and then Kaval?
So I think this one thing we're kind of looking at is HR becoming one of the most critical roles within the organization. Yeah. And what we're seeing is that, I don't know if it's early enough or is it already a trend that I can say, but multiple companies actually taking the call that one of their best leadership team members now playing the HR head role. So it's not the typical, someone who has grown the system as a HR head, but take one of those leaders who do with, whatever, it could be distribution, it could be sales, it could be market, but taking one of those strong persons and making them the HR head, which is one interesting trend we are seeing, because the importance of this goes up. And that changes the flavor completely, right? Because that's the start to shake up the system at some level. So I think that's one, Giri, that we're seeing. And the second one, as I said, is somewhere this, I think these crises teach us really what is critical and what is more versus everything that we've built around, right? Now, at Bain, we've kind of looked at this thing about the professional management, and it's done a phenomenal job, right? I mean, the era of professional management has been there for 20, 30 years or so, and has done a great job. But maybe that time has passed, right? Maybe there's a lot of bureaucracy that's actually crept into each of our organizations now, right? So I think these kind of things really bring up this notion of who is most critical to the organization. And if they are most critical, are we making sure that we are in service of those people, and anywhere where there's a distraction, kind of take out? And I think that's a big mindset shift to kind of do, which is the second one, I would say. And the third is this whole, if I had to look at talent as three communities, right? Community one is disruptors. They're the innovators. They are the ones who are coming up with new ideas. Community two is executors, which is really people who will get things done on the ground. And this community three, which I alluded to earlier, is scalers. And that's the scarce talent, right? Because you will always see the innovator talking about what's the next big idea. You will have the executor kind of going there. But unless we have this, and this is true for any organization, you take it in finance, you take it in marketing, you take it in R&D, you do need that mix where it is there. And being able to identify those people and kind of putting them in the forefront of it. I think these would be the three things I'd say in terms of talent.
No, very good. No, I think, this is a very important thing as large organizations like ours kind of try to get into the new reality. I think we have we have to work with our existing people who have been so loyal and who have contributed to the success of the companies, actually. I just want to segue into something slightly different. And I think this again comes back to something that Sanjeev said in terms of people increasing at-home consumption, asking for bartenders to come and show them about mixers, actually. I think while the digital world is changing, what about hyper-localization, actually? Is that something that you see tremendously going up? One, because of clean tech, environmental concerns, and secondly, the whole community. And one of the things we have seen, at least in the hotel industry, is that a lot of imports that were coming from different countries have stopped, actually. And so suddenly, if you want cheeses, you will not get the international cheeses. So there's an opportunity for Indian cheeses. So there's a lot of localization, and within that, hyper-localization, and some of these delivery guys like Swiggy or Dunzo or VFast and all are enabling things in a different way. How do you see that playing out, actually? Is that a big trend that you see in this era now? Shyam and then Kaval, one of you can answer that.
Yeah, Kaval, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, Giri, I'll try and address it in 2 or 3 different ways. I think the hyper-localization in terms of local sourcing, local consumption, that is obviously a strong trend led by COVID. But my own belief is that, it may not be something which will be the, sustaining or the long-term trend, because eventually, there will have to be a balance between the efficiencies of doing business and how do you manage that. I'll give you a simple example. There are lots of these opportunities today where either the local, let's say home chefs or, people who have started now cooking small quantities on a everyday basis, putting it on apps like Foodie Buddy, etc. And huge demand because, everybody is in this mindset. Or, we have the flower vendor, the ice cream vendor, the fresh vegetables from the nearby village vendors. They come and, they have WhatsApp groups and all that. So I think there is a growing, desire and almost a heightened awareness that you want to support the local community. But eventually, the provider network to scale itself will become the bottleneck. And I think we'll have to find that balance, because today, somebody is making 10 dishes at home and supplying to the local community. Tomorrow you tell them you have to make 100. It's not possible, because then you need industrial scale kitchen, then you need different processes, and you need the entire business model is different. So I think this concept of hyper localization to the extent of local communities catering to each other is, I think, a great precursor to what could potentially happen, especially on the retail and distribution side. Well, I feel that that's the area which, again, what Geo is attempting to do, and which I think every retailer, every local, whether it's a restaurant chain or whether it's any other service provider, is going to find more and more opportunity, is to provide a tech platform, and it could be WhatsApp for all that matters, to be able to cater to this thing. So it's almost like, you take our, 20-year-old habit of calling up the local grocery store and ordering a loaf of bread or a couple of things at home, suddenly getting turbocharged because technology allows you to do it at scale. So it's an interesting combination of, the desire and the opportunity to go more hyper local, but in still a more B2B or B2C kind of a model rather than a C2C model. At least that's what my intuition is. But I think the growing awareness of this and the desire to look for speciality within the area you are, and because the efficiencies of payment systems, efficiencies of being able to use technology for ordering, and then of course the delivery networks will allow that to happen. I think some of our buying habits, so this 10% of e-commerce that Shyam talked about, some of it may actually happen by empowering the retail network, not necessarily through only the mega players like Amazon and Big Basket and Flipkart.
Mhm. Very good. I think I come back to the larger macro question, which can play into the consumption theme, which is the rise of smart cities, affordable housing, uh, what do you say, education systems. How do you see that playing out at this point of time? Is India doing enough? Is there adequate private sector participation? Are there enablers which are missing at this point of time? Because ultimately, I think while Shyam talked about the rural urban divide, I think with smart city development and all of that is going to get gradually blurred actually. How do you see some of those enablers being accelerated? Are we doing enough on that?
Shyam, you want to take a shot at that?
Please go ahead, Kamal, and I can add if at all.
Sure. So honestly, I don't have a very, studied view, unfortunately, Giri, on this one. That's why I was seeing if Shyam had a stronger point of view. But clearly, the in the context of what you mentioned, the hyper localization, making clusters or geographies self-sufficient in everything that happens. I think that trend certainly will almost follow the same wave of trying to build communities which are self-sustained and self-sufficient. And Shyam briefly mentioned something which is a fascinating idea, is this whole cluster strategy and the many India strategy. Maybe he can talk a little bit about that, because more and more we are realizing that it's not metro versus tier 1 versus tier 2. It's not a certain profile. It is clustered. And just as a signing off point, we did this exercise with a consulting firm for Licious, where they identified these 100 clusters across the top 30-40 cities of India, which are their definition of the most critical markets that they want to capture. And it has nothing to do with either region or city or geography. So it could be 5 clusters in Mumbai and 3 in Delhi and 2 in Bangalore and 1 in Coimbatore or Chandigarh and so on and so forth. So I think that is really, I am extrapolating your question a little bit into a slightly different direction. But I feel that finding, and the beauty is what digital has done for us. It allows us to seamlessly bring these, let's call it cohorts or communities, even though geographically they may be very widely distributed. So Mama Earth, which is one of our companies, doing extremely well. They talk to moms of a certain profile. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Gurgaon or you're in Chandigarh or you're in Pune or Bangalore. as long as you are able to connect with that sensibility, I'm able to build it. So in a way, you're almost breaking the boundaries of physical locations into a very different way of defining your cohorts through the digital infrastructure.
Yeah, that's very well said, Kamal. The only thing I would kind of add is there was an interesting conversation I had with an etymologist, and kind of looking at consumer behaviors. And so one thing they said, which is striking, is consumer segmentation needs to be rethought completely, and that's exactly what Kamal was talking about. You have, on an average, the aspirational Indian, right? Irrespective of the city, you have an aspirational Indian. And, with digital, I think this whole imagined reality or imagined life that they are actually living is very different from the, the real life that they're actually living. So I think aspiration is no longer, so any consumer segmentation we look at where we say aspirational Indian and all of that, I think we've got it wrong. And Kamal made this point about access becomes the most important one. I think there is definitely and to your point, Giri, earlier about how do you get, so one is, is there an aspiration? Then there is an access, and then there is wealth. I think you need to get all these three right. I think wealth is where a lot the government will have to do. And, I think that entire aspect is there. Aspiration, great news, is existent. Then what do you do with the access that Kamal talked about, the retail infrastructure, digital, that becomes important. And we see now influencer-led models, like, what Misho is doing, what others are doing. It's just so powerful that as long as I can trust someone and I look up to that person, how can I start kind of looking at that, believing them and actually buying? So China is actually a great example that way, very different from our country. But if you look at Pinduoduo and what they did, it's a fascinating story, right? I mean, Alibaba and JD are as big as it gets. We're talking about, like, globally largest kind of retailers and all of that. And there was this, Pinduoduo, which came in much later, 5-7 years after, wherever this thing, when they spiked. And then they have basically opened up a completely different occasion and a completely different consumer, which needed the group buying, the comfort that, I will bring people together, so I trust the platform and I'm going to buy. And it forced Ali and JD to open those things, right? So they have a version now where they allow group buying. So I'm just saying, like, in summary, access is what we need to solve for as companies. Wealth is something, of course, a lot of us have a role to play, but also government heavily. Aspiration is a given in this country, and so we should take it forward from there.
Excellent, excellent. I think we are coming to the close of the session. Maybe what I'll do is that maybe starting with, maybe we'll start with Dipanjan, then Kaval and you in terms of closing comments. And then I don't see any other questions at this point of time. Maybe with the 3 comments, then we can close. Over to you, Dipanjan.
Yeah, thanks, Green. I think it's been a great conversation, a lot of brainstorming and good points to come out. I think I would just summarize from my point of view and say that, look, while there is a lot of gloom, you read the newspaper every morning and you don't know what to interpret. You don't know whether things are going, good, bad, ugly, too ugly. I think there is a lot of green shoots. Sometimes it doesn't come out as much as it should. Underneath all the work that is going on by different companies, nobody, at least we know or we've seen from this conversation, is taking it lying low. That everybody in their own right is trying to fight, trying to do something different about it, trying to be innovative. And that would actually build that whole muscle memory of being a more resilient company as we come strong. There is no sight of, what is the end of COVID. Possibly the COVID has ended. Possibly this is the post-COVID era already, right? So there will be a uncertainty which will continue with us all the time. And therefore, within this ecosystem, how do we maximize? I think all what we discussed today was pretty much our ideas and some thought starters on those front. And I think we all pool together the various innovations, and I think the time to be innovative and time to be moving ahead with maybe much more force.
Yeah, Kaval.
I'll take a slightly broader view of this. I think the points that we have discussed, and like Shyam well summarized in the end, the whole aspect of aspirational wealth and access. I think next 10 years are going to be dramatic as far as consumption in India is concerned. All of these, including infrastructure, including all the aspects, are going to fall into place. The onus is actually on how do we create choices, how do we create very exciting new opportunities of consumption for the consumer. And that's where I think the bigger ecosystem of the larger players, of the established players, and many more companies which will come in. So, while we are excited in a very micro way with our startup ecosystem and all that, I mean, we'll still continue to be minuscule players in the bigger scheme of things. So, given that the audience here represents some of the large organizations and, what can be done, I think the challenge is really the next 10 years is squarely on the shoulders of the big boys on how do you leverage this, because if that whole consumption wave grows to that 5 trillion or whatever that number we talk about, then everything, all boats will rise. So it is parochially in all of our interests that we do it, whether it's organizational changes, whether it's the way you approach the business models, whether it is fast innovation, whether it is fast fail. There are so many things that we have learned from the early ecosystem of the startups which can be adopted. So I'm throwing it more as a challenge and an opportunity for the larger organizations to really take the gauntlet and take it forward. Like Sanjeev said, the seminal changes happening in every industry. And for us as VCs in startups, that would be a great ecosystem within which to build more exciting brands.
Yeah, no, excellent. And Shyam, for your final thoughts?
I think Kawal summarized it quite well. The one thing I just remind is exactly, I mean, I think the responsibility is very high. Year after, if you look at any financial crisis, any crisis in the past, that's where, the men are differentiated from the boys, or the women from the girls, we gender agnostic. But, I think that is critical. And this is a time the companies, if we were to take this as an opportunity and make the right moves, that can pay dividends for the next 10, 15 years. So being mindful of that is the only thing I would add.
Great. No, I think thank you all for this fantastic session. I think for me personally, I think the COVID has been a time of introspection actually. And I think a lot of these changes are important for us as individuals actually, in terms of how we navigate the change ourselves actually. Because just like we talk about market trends and organizations needing to change, I think the implications for us to change is significant. And there are huge opportunities in terms of pivoting into, I've always been a large organization man, and I always wonder, will I ever become a small organization man? I do it in a surrogate fashion through angel investments when I see these exciting little companies. And I, out of curiosity, I think hopefully it will become an asset class, Kawal. I think we don't know. I don't know about that, because I think one of my biggest disappointments is that the angel ecosystem doesn't get exits actually. But that's a conversation for another day. But thank you very much for this very nice conversation on consumption-led growth. And you're right, the opportunities are big, and it's up to us in terms of how we take advantage of that. Over to you, Pranjal.
Thank you, Giri. You thank everybody. On behalf of the board, let me thank you for chairing this wonderful session. I think we had a very, very important topic. I think consumer sentiment is really going to be the key for our revival. And also thanks to Sanjeev for coming in. I requested him to come in. Thanks to Giri for his thoughts. We will continue to hold these discussions over the next few months. Every month we do at least one. We will look at some of the macro pictures, and we are currently looking at issue of talent, which Giri referred to. So there's a working group within the CFO board working on the talent needs. Second part is also we're going to be engaging with some senior policymakers in the coming days to get a view of what is happening there. But please do watch this space and send us your feedback on any thoughts and ideas you may have. Thanks again for joining us today. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.